Now, the Prime Minister is chairing a meeting of her Cabinet Subcommittee on Brexit today, where ministers will discuss the UK's future relationship with the EU. But over in Brussels, the foreign ministers of the remaining 27 EU countries are meeting to mark an important point in the Brexit process, as they finalise their negotiating stance on the transition period immediately after Brexit. Also referred to as the implementation phase, it's the period of a few years after we leave in March next year. So let's look at the key issues that will be up for negotiation. So how long will the transition last? Well, the UK has said about 2 years and the EU has suggested December 2020. The EU wants the UK to honour all free trade agreements and other arrangements between the EU and other countries. It doesn't want the UK to sign any deals of its own, although the UK says it can negotiate and even sign deals to come into effect after transition. The EU wants freedom of movement to continue as before, but the government is planning to introduce a registration system for EU citizens coming to live in the UK during the transition. The EU wants the UK to comply with all EU laws and regulations during transition, including any changes made without UK approval. But the government wants a new mechanism to vet any disagreements over rules brought in during the transition. Adam Fleming is in Brussels and can tell us more. Adam, welcome back to the programme. So what should we expect?
Hi, Joe. Well, what we should expect in the next few minutes is European affairs ministers from the 27 remaining EU countries arriving on the red carpet. I've just seen the Austrian representative, the Danish and the Bulgarian, and so they'll stop and it's an opportunity for us to ask them questions about the Brexit process, what they think about shenanigans in the UK at the moment. Then they'll sit down for their meeting and at around 3:30 this afternoon they will publish their negotiating directives, which is a document a few pages long setting out their position on this transition period, which the British government prefers to call it implementation phase. Then we're going to get a press conference, we think, with Michel Barnier, our old friend, the EU's chief negotiator, who we've not heard from for a little while, and then he's got the green light to start talking formally with the British government about actually getting the details of this transition or implementation phase nailed down. And of course the British government would like there to be a big political agreement about the transition terms by the time of the next summit of EU leaders, which will be on the 23rd of March.
Any signs of agreement so far between the two sides broadly on the transition?
Well, the British government's view and the view of British officials is that these transition guidelines have been drawn up as a result of a request from the UK and the speech that the Prime Minister made in Florence, where she said she wanted access to each other's markets to continue on current terms. So the UK spin, if you like, is that these are guidelines and the directives that have been drawn up with the UK in mind. The EU side say, well, this is what we're offering you, this is the only way it can be done, with the UK sticking to all the rules and all the obligations that basically come with EU membership without being a member of the EU. I think the big thing that will have to be agreed between the two sides in the next few weeks, though, is this process for dealing with issues of mutual interest. So, for example, the fishing quotas, which will have to be set for the year 2020 at a meeting of fisheries ministers here in Brussels in December 2019. Now, the UK will be bound by those fishing quotas, but they won't have a seat at the table, technically. So a way will have to be found for them to have an ear to the door or stand by the table rather than having a seat at the table, whatever metaphor you want to use, so that that issue of mutual interest can still be sorted out by the two sides.
Adam Fleming, thank you very much. Well, let's speak now to the Belgian MEP Philippe Lambert. He's a member of the European Parliament's Brexit steering group and he's in Brussels. Hello, Philippe Lambert. In your mind, how long do you think the transition period or implementation phase will be?
Well, I know that both the UK and the European Union want this to be short, around about 2 years, but frankly speaking, I wouldn't bet too much money on this because, well, when you look at the number of things that have to be negotiated during the transition period for a deal to be finalized in that period, well, I guess that you will need much more time than the anticipated 2 years. So we should not be too ideological about that, unless, of course, some resent the fact that the only way for the UK to keep full access to the European single market in the meantime means abiding by the EU regulation, and that's true. It means a number of obligations for the UK, but also a number of rights during the transition period. Basically, the United Kingdom would be in a quasi-member state situation in the transition period, except that it would not sit at the table where decisions are being made. And I understand that this is seen as a not very comfortable position, but then again, you need time to finalise the future relationship.
Yeah, does that mean that quasi sort of status, as you say, in terms of membership? Would you expect the UK to still contribute to the EU budget if it were to be longer than 2 years, the transition period?
Yes, that's part of the equation. And by the way, in her Florence speech, Theresa May already conceded that during the transition, the United Kingdom would contribute in order to secure access to the single market. Now, my honest assessment of the situation of the commitment made in December not to have any border in Ireland and not any border in the Irish Sea might mean that ultimately the United Kingdom would stay fully in the single market and customs union. But of course, that is what negotiation will tell us.
Right, and in that negotiation, would you accept the fact that freedom of movement would change even during the transition period if the UK is developing its own registration system, that would be negotiated as part of the implementation phase?
There, I must say, I don't believe so. There's quite a large degree of unanimity on the EU27 side that while the UK remains fully into the single market and customs union, all the obligations that come with it, including freedom of circulation of people, stand. And therefore, there's not really wiggle room there. There's a lot of wiggle room afterwards for the future relationship, but not during the transition period.
All right, and what about in terms of the rules that you say Britain would be under the jurisdiction of the rules that are made, any new rules, in fact, made during a transition period? Would the UK, in your mind, should it be allowed to have input still in those rules that would then come over Britain?
Well, I'm not too ideological on that. Certainly, if Brexit has happened at the end of March 2019, no Brit will sit in the European Parliament, in the European Commission College and in the European Council. Yet, I think that it would make sense that we receive non-binding opinions by the British government. You know, sometimes there are very good ideas coming out of London and we should heed them if they make sense. I've always rejoiced at many contributions that the British government has been making, and I won't change my mind afterwards. Now, the key point is that, well, it can be advice, it can be requests, but they can't be binding on the 27.
Right. Do you, I mean, you speak for the Parliament, obviously, as an MEP. Your views that you've just reflected there on a number of issues, is that also, do you think, the opinions of the leaders of the countries represented by the Council?
Well, I would guess so. Except maybe on the duration of the transition, I am less adamant than some on this. Some say, well, you know, we can't have a longer transition because the current multi-annual budgetary framework expires in 2020, and it would be a bit cumbersome to draw the next multi-annual budget without the UK, but with it. I mean, taking into account a British contribution to it or not, frankly speaking, to me, it's a non-issue. I mean, if the transition has to be longer, it has to be longer because a cliff edge would be bad for both the EU27 and the United Kingdom. Okay. And therefore, if we need a longer transition period, fine by me. But I know that some have a more ideological view about that.
Philippe Lambert, just a moment. I'm going to bring in a guest in the studio, a Tory MP, Bim Afalami, and I'll come back to you in just a moment. What's your reaction to a longer transition period, if necessary? And actually, Philippe Lambert says he probably thinks it will be. No alternative immigration or registration system during the transition. And yes, we would have to take all new rules that come into play while we are still in this quasi-membership role.
Well, I think the most interesting thing that the gentleman said was that he was quite flexible and he thought other EU states would be flexible
around those issues.
Around Britain having a say in certain rules that would apply to us during the transition period. That is really important, but I don't think we should be too ideological about this. We need to make sure that as we leave the European Union, we get it right. And if getting it right means that in the process of those 2 years, we have to, you know, accept things that we otherwise won't accept after that period, then we have to do so, because I think it's important that when we leave, we do it on the right terms in the right way.
And you'd be happy to see transition go beyond December 2020 or March 2021?
No, I think that when you agree an 18-month or 2-year, whatever the time period is, we've got to stick to that. That's very important.
Why?
Well,
I mean,
because
it almost says it won't be achievable.
Well, I think a lot of people said lots of things haven't been achievable in this process, and they've been achieved. What's important is we set the date, we work towards that 2-year or 18-month, however long it is, period, and we get it done by then.
Philippe Lambert, it's now evident that the UK wouldn't be the only country to vote to leave the EU in an in-out referendum. You no doubt heard the French president revealing that he believes voters in France would do the same if given the choice. Hardly a vote of confidence in the European Union, is it?
Well, I do not share that view. What I witness on the ground, and not just in my home country, is that yes, there is resentment about many policies carried out at European level, but no, there's not. That resentment doesn't translate into a will to leave. In other terms, I think that the vast majority of our citizens want to change the set of policies that are carried out at European level. Look at the level of inequality that we have, for instance. People resent that, and the EU is often seen as a vehicle of those inequality policies. Well, we need to change that. But you know, it's not by chance that Marine Le Pen lost in the French campaign. It's not by chance that the populists across Europe are toning down their Eurosceptical rhetoric.
But Emmanuel Macron thought even so that actually French voters would vote to leave if given an in-out referendum.
Well, I mean, his opinion is worth anyone else's, so I don't share that opinion.
Right. I mean, is it the case, then, in your mind, that the EU does have to show it's being very tough on Britain to deter any other member states deciding to hold an in-out referendum?
No, I think that is bad policy. I mean, keeping people together by scaremongering is not a good policy. So we should be fair in our dealings with the UK, and indeed, membership comes with benefits and with obligations. And lack of membership comes with benefits and with negatives as well. So we do not have to make the situation worse than it is, because I do believe that for the UK, being out of the single market and customs union and being out of many cooperations with the European Union is not a good place to be in. And I think people will realize that without us being forced to darken the picture. I think it's not good policies. We should keep an open hand and again, well, an extended hand. And again, to me, on the issue of the UK having a say, I want to be very precise.
All right.
That the UK can contribute opinions, fine, but it cannot have a voice in the decision.
Right.
So the decision is for the 27 to make.
Philippe Lambert, thank you very much. That then slightly clarifies. They could have a voice at the table, but it wouldn't be binding. They really wouldn't have a decisive say at the table on rules from the European Court of Justice. Would you accept that?
Well, I think we've got to wait and see what the negotiation turns up. He is making a point from the EU's perspective. Obviously, the British government view currently is different, and we'll see where we get to.
Right. Do you agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg, Bernard Jenkin and other Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party that Philip Hammond is a block to Brexit and should be sacked?
No, I don't agree with that. I think that's wrong. And I think that Philip Hammond, along with the other cabinet ministers who I've spoken to about this and other issues, are working very hard with the Prime Minister to get the best deal we can.
Kat, on the idea and issue of a second referendum, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, has said that isn't going to happen. Do you agree with him when there are so many Labour Party members, the vast majority, who would like to see a second referendum and a vote on the deal?
I do agree with Jeremy. I campaigned to remain in the referendum, but I was very clear when I was campaigning that this was the referendum that would decide. And unfortunately, from my point of view, of course, I was on the losing side in that referendum. But I respect the outcome of it. And now we have to deliver. But there should be a binding vote in Parliament on the final deal. And that was something that the Labour Party called for and we're hoping to achieve. And
what sort of customs union does Labour want to see with the EU?
Well, it's obvious that the EU 27 are some of our geographically closest neighbours that we will want to continue trading with. So therefore, it makes sense to be in a customs union. And that, to be honest,
would that work?
Open to negotiations. I mean, this is a long way off now, and the negotiations are to be had on that. But it's important that business in Britain can trade with the EU 27 countries.
Right. So you've got the same position then with the Conservative Party on that?
No, I think that the direction of travel that we're seeing from David Davis and from Theresa May right now, I think is chaotic. I think that, given that it's now nearly 2 years since we had this referendum, to have only got this far, I think is quite irresponsible on the part of the government.
But we don't know your end state either at the moment. I mean, you say it's chaotic. That may be the process. But in terms of what you're offering voters, in terms of where you would be with the Brexit negotiations, what is the difference in terms of the close alignment with the EU that some are saying within the government and what you're offering?
Well, we don't want to see a Brexit deal that will damage jobs in the British economy or reduce environmental protections or workers' rights. And I think that the difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party probably rests mostly on that, because there are a lot of Tory Brexiteers who want to rip up employment rights and want to shred environmental protections.
Well, Bim, is that what you're doing? I mean, is there any risk of that happening?
Well, that's just rubbish and wrong. In relation to the Labour Party, their position is chaotic. You've had front benchers saying, like Barry Gardiner saying they're definitely going to leave the customs union. You've had Diane Abbott saying they want to have a second referendum. You've had others saying that they should stay in the customs union. You've now had Kat saying that there should be a customs union. I don't know what it is. I can't think what voters out there think.
But they're not the government, are they, at the moment? They're not the ones in the negotiation. So can you reassure viewers that there wouldn't be any ripping up of workers' rights or employment rights, that jobs wouldn't be under threat?
Well, no, the government has never said, not once, that we want to get rid of employment rights or get rid of environmental protections. I mean, this is just completely wrong, and it's frankly scaremongering from the Labour Party for political reasons, and I don't think that is helping this country or anybody get the best deal with the European Union.
I think it's really clear that there are Tory backbenchers who do want to see that kind of Brexit. And what we're seeing, and I hope I'm not veering into another story here, right, but with Theresa May, as weak as she is as Prime Minister, is under immense pressure from these backbenchers to do these things about ripping up workers' rights and environmental protections.
Right. Do you see, Bim Afellami, Britain is at risk of becoming a vassal state? That this idea of remaining in the European Union in all but name is now a real prospect, certainly during the transition and possibly beyond?
Well, we talked about the transition, as I accept that during a transition that, we will have to accept certain European rules that we won't have to afterwards. But more generally, the government's been very clear from the beginning that we're going to leave the single market and leave the customs union with the European Union. I don't quite know how that makes us a vassal state.
Right. And in terms of modest changes that Philip Hammond talked about, were you worried about that?
No, I mean, I have to be honest, I haven't seen his speech, so I should probably go and check exactly the detail of what he said.
All right. Now, Theresa May isn't short on advice from members of her own party over how